Chapter 2, Economic Environment. In order to understand the economic environment, you have to understand a little bit about the academic subject of economics. And in order to understand learning any new category of information, there's often vocabulary that goes to it. It's a little bit like learning a new language. Some of the terms that we need to know are scarcity. To be scarce is to be limited in quantity. To some extent, everything is scarce. There isn't an unlimited resource of anything. There's a lot of water on Earth that's 70% water, but there's only a certain percentage of that that is fresh water. Even in places where there are droughts, there's plenty of water around, but there's not an unlimited amount. There always is going to be some cap. There's always a cap on resources, time, money, labor, lifespan, for example. Everything has a limit. Because everything is limited, how we use our resources is important, and we have to manage them appropriately in order to get the most efficient and productive use out of them. That's the study of economics. Economics is the academic pursuit of looking for means of efficient production, how to distribute things that you've created from raw materials, why people consume them, how to get the scarce resources converted into something that adds value to the consumers that are looking for it, and how to get it distributed to everybody with the least amount of waste. Economists typically believe that consumers make decisions on the basis of their own self-interest, and they do think they use the term rational to describe them. In recent times, it's become less and less obvious that consumers always act rationally. From time to time, they make irrational decisions on the basis of things like fear or misunderstanding of information. That's how we end up with bubbles. People invest in something that they think is always going to go up in value, and eventually things become overvalued and they can't sustain it any longer. And then the so-called bubble bursts and people end up losing money. A lot of that is not based on rational decision making. Psychologists know that people aren't always rational, but economists always believe, for the purposes of their study, they're not psychologists. They infer that most people will be making reasonable or rational decisions. What it all is the motivation for it is through self-interest. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but opportunity cost is simply because things are scarce, like money and time. If you spend your money or your time doing one thing, you will not be able to do something else. People typically do a cost benefit analysis and try to do things that they value the most. If you're going to school, you could be doing something else, but you can't if you come to class. If you're going to class, it's because you made a decision that learning something through class is going to provide you with a greater level of value than doing some other option. The economy is the entire structure of economic practices and events that take place. Economists study the economy. There's a national economy, there's a local economy, there's a global economy. When you look at all of the business transactions and commercial activity and nonprofit activity that's taking place, combine it with all of the political and legal things that may impact it, the study of all of that together is a look at the economy. So when someone says, how is the economy doing? They mean generally how our business practice is going. In order to understand the economy today, it's good to do a little bit of a history lesson. So in the early days of North America, the United States, or what became the United States, were originally colonies of the United Kingdom. Canada was split between France and England, and eventually Canada became an independent nation, as well as the United States after the Revolution from 1776 to 1783. Initially, if you go back to the 1600s and 1700s, the people who lived in colonial America were largely farmers. It was an agrarian-based economy. And people who weren't farming were probably working on their own. They were blacksmiths, coopers, people who made barrels, wheelwrights, people who made carriages, things of that nature, as well as lawyers and accountants and other skilled tradesmen. Work was very labor intensive, and even those who had their own businesses probably farmed a little bit because food was not as plentiful as it is today. There wasn't any kind of distribution network, and drought and famine were not uncommon. During the Industrial Revolution, which happened in the 18th century, which is the 1700s, throughout the 19th century, which is the 1800s, and it's still proceeding as we go today, technology basically allowed equipment to be developed that would save labor and make work more efficient. Instead of going out with a shovel or a rake and digging your field so that you could plant your crops, you would have equipment that you could use with animals to do plowing. There was harvesting equipment that was done. There were automated looms that were largely run on water power. So if you think about Massachusetts, many of the so-called mill towns up in Lawrence and the Merrimack Valley region, as well as Fall River and New Bedford, anywhere that there was water moving on a river, that could power a wheel would provide the power in pre-electricity days to run equipment. Rather than having someone hand stitch together a blanket, you could have a loom make a blanket hundreds of times faster. Because there was less work involved in creating products, products became cheaper. And people, because they were able to produce more for the amount of time that they worked, became more productive. Productivity is simply a measurement of how efficient your workers are producing the goods and services that they're providing. Eventually, when the Industrial Revolution kicked into high gear, the economy came to be known as a manufacturing economy. If you have ever seen a movie called Field of Dreams, the tagline in it is, "If you build it, they will come." I suppose the manufacturing economy could be compared to something like, "If you make it, they will buy it." Because it was so difficult to make products earlier, because you could make so many of them, the idea was just to focus on producing as much as you possibly could. And if they're cheaper, people could buy more of it. The example that I'd like to give you is if you had to imagine what it would be like to get a pair of shoes in colonial Massachusetts, there were no real shoe stores. You would have to go to a shoemaker and have them custom make you by hand a pair of shoes. If you could imagine how much money it would cost you today to go into a store and have someone build you leather shoes from scratch, it would probably be several hundred, if not several $1,000s. If your shoes cost a few $1,000s, you would probably only have one pair, and when they were worn out, you would have them repaired rather than getting a new one. With automated equipment, shoes could be mass produced. So instead of buying one pair that would cost thousands of dollars, you could buy another pair for 50 or 60 or $100 relative to the time. And eventually, the manufacturing capability resulted in increased productivity, better efficiency. Prices dropped because the supplies of shoes went up and they were less expensive to make, so the costs went down as well. People could then afford to buy shoes. And the more shoes that were available, maybe I wanted a pair of work shoes, a pair of dress shoes, a pair of hiking boots, whatever it is. Instead of just having one all purpose pair of shoes, you would just manufacture all these different types and people would be able to afford them. Eventually, we moved into a marketing economy because once the productivity wasn't such a big issue where you could create a number of products, then the idea became, how do we get people to buy our products? I've gone into a shoe store that used to exist, I think it was called Off Broadway Shoes, and when I went in there were literally thousands of pairs of shoes. If you're a manufacturer, it's not so much how do we make these shoes, we're making them. Now it becomes how do we market them to the people that are going to buy them? How do we get people to buy our shoes instead of the competition shoes? So the marketing economy really became more focused on the consumer rather than creating the product. So the product is going to be created because we've already kind of mastered the mass manufacturing capabilities through the Industrial Revolution. Now that we have all of these new products, we have to differentiate between them and be able to get people interested in our products so that they can buy ours. As the economy in America progressed and evolved, it became mature and our standard of living increased. That means people were able to make more money. It basically became more expensive. When you have a high standard of living, it costs more money to live here relative to some other place that maybe doesn't have the same level of economic advancement. You can even think about that today. In Boston, it costs a lot of money to live, but it's still nowhere near as expensive as it is to live in New York or maybe even San Francisco. If you moved to Nebraska and you had all of your money in your houses from Boston and you cashed everything out and sold it and moved to Nebraska, you could probably buy a mansion and be considered quite wealthy. The problem is if you got a job in Nebraska, they're not going to pay you as much as they would pay you in Boston, simply because Boston has a more mature, technologically advanced economy compared to some other places, even within the United States. If you look around the world, there are definitely areas of the world where the standards of living are much lower. Where the average person in America may make $50,000 or $60,000 a year, there are countries in the world where the standard of living is much lower, where people maybe only make $5,000 or $10,000 a year. If you're going to manufacture something and you're going to hire someone to work in Massachusetts, you're going to be paying them $50, $60, $70 an hour potentially. If you have someone in another developing country, you may be only paying them less than minimum wage compared to what you would have to pay them here. So it actually became more efficient in terms of cost to have foreign workers who get paid less manufacture goods. So even though the United States still has a pretty huge manufacturing capability, we are mostly a service economy. That means that most people in America work in service, teaching, medicine, restaurants, etc. About 80% of all employees, probably between 70 and 80% of all employees in America work in service jobs. A lot of manufactured goods that are more cheaply prepared and created are imported. Even the cost of sending the equipment and the materials to a foreign country and then shipping them over here is still cheaper because of the savings in cost by paying the salaries that are much lower. More recently, we've moved into the digital economy with the advent of the internet. 20, 30 years ago, when I was going to business school, they kept telling us that the so-called brick and mortar physical locations of businesses are going to go away and most business would be conducted online. It didn't happen as quickly as they thought it would, but we are pretty much there. With Amazon, a lot of people don't go to stores like they used to. They buy things online. You have to have a digital footprint. You have to have a presence on the internet. Even if you're a sole proprietor working in, a suburb of Boston, you may be able to sell things, products and services to people all around the world. The only way they're going to be able to find you is through the internet. And if you can do your accounting and your taxes, take orders and payments and provide for shipping all online, you can imagine that's a lot more efficient than having people pushing paper around. As the economy matured, the division of labor and specialization became a key. We mentioned this a little bit in chapter one. When you have the division of labor, instead of having one person manufacturing something and having to know all of the skills needed to make an entire product, you could divide the labor by having people work on portions of it. What that does is it makes it simpler to train people because they don't have to learn how to do everything. They only have to learn to do a piece of what's going on. Because they can focus on that after they learn it, they can become very good at it. So the quality can improve and the time that it takes to train people can be reduced. That's tied into specialization because once you divide the labor, people become specialists in the particular task that they're focusing on, and they become very good at it. It's a lot easier to become good at things that require 4 or 5 steps than something that requires 50. We mentioned economies of scale before. Scale means size, so you can get an advantage. Economy in this sense meaning efficiency of size. It doesn't always mean that bigger is better, but sometimes it kind of does because if you have a lot of money in the bank, you are able to buy things at a cheaper cost or a cheaper price than others may be able to, which would give you a competitive advantage. Microeconomics and macroeconomics. Micro means small, macro means large. So if you're looking at studying economics on the micro scale, you're looking at the local economy, you're looking at households, you're looking at individual companies, or maybe portions of an industry. When you're looking at macroeconomics, it's a much broader scale and it's looking at the economy as a whole. The government focuses on macroeconomics and macroeconomic techniques to be able to monitor the economy. Things like monetary policy, how much money does the Treasury release, what do we charge for interest rates and the like. Those are all part of macroeconomics, which are things the government tries to do to guide the economy, and it will filter down to the microeconomic level. Monetary and fiscal policies, again, this is at the macro level. So monetary policy, the Federal Reserve, which is basically the nation's bank, the central bank, they take care of how much interest the other banks are going to be charged. They handle the money. Money, just like another product, is passed through to retail outlets, which are basically private commercial banks. They get their money from the government, and the government charges them interest. Those banks then mark up the interest rate that they charge to you when you take out a loan. If the federal government charges the banks a lot more in interest, it makes money more expensive, which means you would borrow less. If the economy is going really well and there's too much inflation, what the Fed will do is raise interest rates in order to purposely slow down the economy. Because believe it or not, a really hot economy can result in inflation due to disequilibrium, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It creates an imbalance between supply and demand. When everybody is demanding something and supply can't keep up, you have disequilibrium and that can cause prices to go up. In order to avoid inflation, they will purposely raise interest rates via the money supply to try and make there be less money to be spent, which would cool the economy down. That also means people would lose their jobs, but it's kind of a trade-off. Inflation, when it gets out of control, can really be destabilizing and kind of destroy an economy as well as the savings of people who are hanging on to the money that can't get the same return to keep up with inflation. Fiscal policy is also the government. It's not necessarily the Fed, but if you want to slow down economic development, you can tax it. The more taxes there are, the more expensive things become. You can regulate trade by including tariffs, which are taxes on foreign goods. The government also raises money by issuing bonds, which are basically loans. If you buy a savings bond, they will pay you an interest rate, and then you can cash it in at a set time. The government raises money all the time by issuing bonds, and they can change how valuable those bonds are depending on how much interest they pay for them. The more money that people invest, the less money there is in the monetary system because the government's buying all of these for the bonds. If they make the bond prices higher by raising interest rates, that pushes more money into the money supply, which can help stimulate the economy. Economic systems are how governments set up the management of their economy. Typically, what you focus on to determine what type of system you have is what kinds of goods and services and how much of each will satisfy the consumer's needs. How is that decided as well is a big part of it, because if it's just supply and demand because people want more or people want less, then businesses will respond in like. If there's a demand for one product, businesses will make more of it. That basically will take care of itself. There's less government control over that. On the other side of the spectrum, the government can say, this is what we're going to be producing and this is how much things are going to cost. So instead of relying on people for what they want and need, the government dictates what it's going to be. And depending on how much of that is going on, will indicate what type of economic system you probably have. Who owns the means of production? Is it the private population or is it the government? Do I own my own business? Do I invest my own money and do the manufacturing? Or does the government own those means of production and do they hire people instead of a private business? If you look at market economies, a market, as we mentioned before, is a place where buyers and sellers come together to satisfy supply and demand and where prices are set. A market economy is where you leave the decisions about what products should be created and what the prices are going to be, and you leave that to the people. People want something, businesses will provide it to them, and it will take care of itself. A competitive market is where you have enough private players providing the goods and services that people are looking to buy. And whenever there's competition, it's usually good for the consumer because if one company exists and that becomes a monopoly, that's worse than having probably a communist nation where the government decides everything, because in this case, the government isn't deciding it. A private company that owns all the means of production are deciding how much to charge you for something. If there's no competition and I'm the only player in town making a particular product, I can charge whatever I want for it. If there's another player in town and they are able to do it more efficiently than me and produce it at a cheaper rate, then I'm going to have to either improve my product or lower my prices, which is to the advantage of consumers. A free market, when you're talking about a market economy, is when you have, I'm not going to say no, because there aren't really any economies that have no constraints or regulation on the economy, but much lower levels of involvement of the government would be considered to be a free market. Planned economies, this is where the government's getting more involved. It's also called a command economy, where the government, or in the case of a monarchy or a dictatorship, or some kind of an oligopoly or a ruling class of capitalists decide how much is going to be produced of a particular good. The types of systems that we usually look at, it's communism, socialism, and capitalism. Communism is at one end of the spectrum. That's where there's the most government control. Karl Marx came up with the Communist Manifesto in the mid 1800s, and he basically said that eventually people would revolt against the people who owned all of the resources, the capital, people known as capitalists, and they would basically team together and create a government in which everyone shares the means of productions and all of the benefits of it, as opposed to private players collecting all of the resources and putting it in their pocket. On paper, it's a good idea, but how in practice it's actually played out over time in the last 100 years or so, it hasn't really worked out particularly well because Marx himself said that communism was supposed to be a worldwide revolution. When the Soviet Union declared itself a communist nation and became a union of Soviet socialist republics, they were the only place in the world that was doing it, and that kind of went against Marx's own philosophy. What ended up happening is you had an isolated economy. The standard of living was relatively low. There were shortages in consumer goods because the government owned everything and couldn't necessarily respond to the needs and wants of the people efficiently. It typically resulted in high prices, and there was also a lot of corruption and little or no freedom. Typically, Typically, democratic countries with high levels of democracy and freedom also have more open markets and more free market capabilities, whereas nations that are more closed and more limited in terms of their democratic rights and freedoms for their people tend to have closed economies that are operated by the government. Socialism is somewhere in between communism and capitalism. It's where not all of the means of productions, but some of them, let's say the utility companies are owned by the state, maybe the steel industries are owned by the state, but all other private industries own the other means of production. So it's kind of a mixture between capitalism and communism. The examples that they have here are Sweden, Israel, and India, which are a little bit of a mix between a government mandating what's going on and individual private capital holders being able to determine how best to run their company. Capitalism is free enterprise or a free market system. This is where the individuals own the materials and the resources necessary to provide goods. Pure capitalism is also known as laissez-faire, where Adam Smith famously said the invisible hand of the economy will take care of itself. If you've got people with demand, with other people with money to be able to put the capital together to satisfy that demand through supply, then it will take care of itself. That's not always true because there are certain things that people need that the free enterprise capitalist system will not necessarily cater to. If I have a disease and I need medicine that is very rare and very expensive, it's not going to be profitable to make it because I'm not going to be able to afford to do it anyway. So why would a company do it? The government could get involved and make subsidies through taxes in order to spur innovation in this particular area and make this type of treatments available to those who need it. Modified capitalism differs from pure capitalism because the government does intervene and regulate businesses to some level. Where we are is that most economies are mixed economies. There's really no pure capitalism or socialist or communist nation. You're going to Bunker Hill Community College. Your tuition is subsidized by taxpayers. So that's a little bit of a socialist ideal built into a free market capitalist society. The idea is that the government figured that providing an education to people would make the country better, make the economy better for that matter. Things like regulations about food. If you only wanted to make a profit, you wouldn't necessarily be worried about whether or not the food that people are eating is safe. So we do have some regulation, we do have some taxation. We, in this country, own all of the means of production. The government is not involved with it. The government very rarely gets involved in telling you how much you have to charge for something. There's a few slides on here that just shows communism, socialism, and capitalism, business ownership under communism versus socialism and capitalism. I'm not going to go over it in this lecture, but please read those slides. A greater number of countries have merged into a mixed economy. Even China, which has been a communist nation for quite a while, since probably around 48 or 49, they've modernized their economy by employing aspects of capitalism. They have free trade zones within their region where the government doesn't have as much authority as they typically would in order to stimulate the economy. Since making those reforms to implement some forms of capitalism while retaining control as a communist regime, their economy has grown significantly over the last 20 years. Globalization has also had an impact on the global economy as more nations are interdependent upon one another. While there are benefits of the global economy, and it can raise incomes for a lot of people throughout the world, especially when you're talking about international trade, like in the United States, where it has the largest economy in the world and it imports quite a bit of goods and products from other places. That enables the countries that are importing to the United States to increase their economic status. However, the more interconnected the world becomes, the more at risk all of the different countries in the world are if there happens to be an economic downturn. If the United States is interconnected with every other country and the United States has an economic downturn, that will impact all of the other nations that it deals with. Previously, with a less globalized economy, economic contraction could be contained to only a handful of countries, whereas now we are finding that when there is an economic problem, multiple countries around the world, even the entire global economy, can be negatively impacted.
We had a contagion that operated almost around the globe. The panic from Lehman spreads to AIG, spreads to Morgan Stanley, spreads to Goldman Sachs. Suddenly, Ireland is having problems. Suddenly, the Bank of England is bailing out banks. Suddenly, Iceland is bankrupt. The government, the state of Iceland, it's bankrupt. An entire country. Suddenly, China has gone from being one of the world's highest growth countries to almost a no-growth country in the flash of an eye. That's contagion.
We'd spoken about supply and demand previously, so let's take a look at demand. As we noted, demand is the amount of a good or service consumers are willing and able to pay and purchase at a particular price. The price is what a buyer pays for a specific good or service. As we noted, price is not the same as cost. Cost is the expense to create the product. Price is what the producer of that product charges the end user, typically with a markup to make a profit. The quantity demanded is the total number of units that consumers would seek to get at a particular price. Usually what happens is if the price goes up, demand goes down because people don't want to pay for something if they can't afford it, or they don't find that it has the same value that it may have had at a lower price. When the price drops, typically demand increases. The demand curve is a graphical illustration that would show the relationship between demand and how the price plays out in a given market. Ceteris paribus is a Latin term that really basically states that we're only looking at two items to consider when we're looking at the demand curve. There are many variables that can affect whether or not demand increases or decreases or stays the same. We're looking at nothing other than price and its impact on demand. While useful as an economic principle in order to study how the economy is going, there are so many variables that are involved in what could impact price and therefore demand, whether it be a resource scarcity, a natural disaster, a war, changing opinions of consumers. Multiple things can play into it. However, economists don't really look at all of the details of it until after the fact. Typically, they're just looking at what's going on with the price and how much of a product is demanded at a particular rate. By doing so and limiting it to only price, while excluding all of the other aspects, you can focus on how the economy works and what drives price and what drives demand in response to price. This chart is just a very simple example of how changing quantity demanded can have an impact on price. Typically, if the price goes up, the quantity goes down, and you can see the X and the Y axes here. Price from bottom to top, if it's higher to the top, it's more expensive. As the price drops, the quantity typically goes up because people can afford it, so they purchase more of it. When demand changes, the entire demand curve can shift. What that means is in the example below, in A, D0 is the initial demand, and then it moves over, the demand curve shifts over to the right, which shows that there are more quantity being purchased. Factors that can affect demand include consumer preferences, whether or not incomes are rising to keep up with inflation or perhaps even higher than inflation. Honestly, that doesn't happen very frequently. The prices of substitutes, if you can't get any other substitutes that are less expensive, then one particular product will have demand increase because the price will be more competitive. They also mention complements. You can see the word complement is spelled with an E, not an I. You're not telling someone that they look good. A complement with an E means that it's two things that go together, complementary. So if you're buying cereal and the cereal drops in price, you might eat more cereal. Most people put milk on cereal, so the complementary purchase here would be milk that would go along with the increased purchase in cereal due to the price of cereal. If something happens to decrease demand, you'll see on example B in the chart, the D line is the initial one, and then it shifts to the left, which means it's contracting. The product could become less popular. There's a recession, so people don't have enough money to pay for it. The substitute of another product is more competitive, so people start buying that product instead. As I noted, there are multiple factors that can play into it. A little more detail about those factors includes income. When the economy contracts, people typically lose their jobs, and when they're unemployed, they do not go out and buy things the way that they used to. If the economy is going well and you get a raise, if you have more money to spend, you may buy more of the particular product. If income increases and a product demand falls, that means that is an inferior good. You would expect people to buy more of something when they have more money. It may be that it was a bad or inferior in terms of quality good that happened to be cheaper. And when people didn't have any money, they had no choice but to buy it. But as soon as they made more money, they bought what they perceived to be a better good, and the demand for this other good fades. Consumer preferences can be impacted. Chicken is perceived to be a healthier food than beef, so if people started eating more beef, we talked about opportunity cost. If you're buying chicken, and you're probably not going to be buying beef, so when chicken rose, the consumption of beef would fall. If you're looking at a demand curve for chicken, that curve would shift to the right as demand increases, and the demand curve for beef would shift to the left because it would decrease. Composition of the population can have an impact on demand. An example would be that the nation is becoming older on average. The elderly population by 2030 is expected to be about 7.4% higher than it was in 2000. The types of products that that particular cohort of the demographic of the population, they would buy those products more frequently because there's more of them. Changes in prices of related products, we mentioned that there could be other prices like substitutes and complements that could have an impact on it. Supply is the amount of a product that a producer is willing to make at a particular price point. It is intrinsically tied to demand because the more people demand something, the more likely a manufacturer is to make a product in order to get a profit from it because they know that there will be a market for that product. If there is a shortage of materials, manufacturers would typically spend more time manufacturing a product because they want to meet demand and they know that there's a market for it that needs to be satisfied. The higher the price is, it usually leads to a higher quantity of the materials that are being supplied. That is because demand typically drops, as we said. If the market can sustain higher prices, manufacturers can make bigger profits. So therefore, if there is an increase in price, people will typically manufacture more of something to satisfy the demand. By making more, the price would possibly fall when you look at the competitors. If I'm manufacturing a product or a service and someone is able to pay $10 for it, that may be attractive to other manufacturers who believe that they can make it at $8. So they will flood the market with the cheaper version of it. The price may go down, but the supply will increase. In the same vein, if variables result in an increase in the price, the supply could be higher simply because there's a surplus, because people aren't willing to buy it at the particular price point. So here's an example of a supply curve. The x-axis has the price per gallon. Bottom is $1, top is 2.20. So as the curve goes up, the price goes up. As you can see from the bottom on the left, it's 300 in millions of gallons to a total of 900 in millions of gallons. And each of those plot points show that at $1 per gallon, for example, at the bottom, you've got 500 million gallons of gasoline that are available. As the price continues to increase, the quantity goes up. Factors that could affect supply includes cost of inputs, labor could increase due to inflation, materials could increase due to inflation or supply shocks of some sort, shortages due to unexpected activities such as natural disasters or war. However, when those costs decrease, it makes it less expensive for the products to be created, so profits can increase. Because if you are able to sell something at the same price, but you are able to reduce your costs, then the profit margin will be higher and you'll make more money. This slide is very similar to the other one. A shows the supply shift to the right, B shows the supply shift to the left. Supply shifts to the right, better for production, input prices are dropping, improved technology, etc. That means that the supply is going to increase. When poor natural conditions, rise in input prices, higher taxes, etc., things that are going to make products more expensive, the supply will drop. The supply may drop because demand is lower because people can't afford it. Concurrently with that, or immediately after it, the indicator being that if prices are going up and people can't afford it, manufacturers will respond by not making as much of a particular product. When it becomes more scarce again, the prices may go up because people will have to pay to get something that they need. Equilibrium, as we had mentioned previously, is the point on the graph at which supply and demand intersect. When you have equilibrium, that means that supply and demand are being met at a particular price point and at a particular quantity. So in this, $1.40 is where supply and demand meet at 600 million gallons. Surplus and shortage refers to supply, so when the price is below the equilibrium level, you will have excess demand or a shortage of supply. If the price is above the equilibrium level, you will have a surplus. Economic pressures typically react to this and move the price towards the equilibrium level. When you have disequilibrium, meaning that there is a short-term shock or some type of variation or variable at play that has an impact on it, you're usually going to have a shift in the demand or supply curves. Eventually, you will arrive at equilibrium again, but when you have disequilibrium, you have some chaos in the markets. It's harder to determine how much things are going to be, and manufacturers have a hard time understanding how much to produce. After a while, when the economy settles down, you end up back at an equilibrium point. It may be a different point to reflect a new normal, but it will be eventually settling at an equilibrium point. If you're pricing something above the equilibrium level, you will end up with a surplus because people won't be buying it. It's too expensive. A shortage is when the price is below the equilibrium level. People will start buying something because it's cheaper, but you'll end up having a shortage unless supply is increased. As noted, if a market is not at an equilibrium, if you have a period of disequilibrium, economic pressures typically move the market back towards the equilibrium price. If you have a shortage, there are going to be suppliers out there that know that if they manufacture something, they're going to be able to sell it. So the supply will increase and you will eventually get back to equilibrium. If demand drops and you have too much of something, manufacturers will pull back and not make as much of it. So eventually, even though you may have a short period of disequilibrium, eventually you will come back to an equilibrium point. As noted, it may not be the same equilibrium point it had been previously, but you will eventually arrive at a point where you can achieve equilibrium. When you're looking at the health of the economy, how well an economy is performing, economists look at indicators. An economic indicator is usually a statistic, usually collected by the government, that gives information about how well the economy is performing. A lagging indicator shows the status of the economy a few months ago. So you're looking back into the past. It's not necessarily a reflection of how the economy is working today. There are a lot of data that we look at that is lagging indicators. We don't usually know that we're in a recession until the government collects all the information from the previous quarter or 2 quarters and then concludes that we either have had 2 quarters of economic contraction, which would result in a recession. It's usually something that we may not know about at the time. You have to collect the data and then go back and take a look to find out where you stand. A leading economic indicator is used to predict where you may be in the future, 3 to 12 months in the future. Again, ironically, you do this by looking at historically the types of things that indicate in advance when the economy might be taking off. So there may be certain things that you can measure when they go up or down. The numbers that you do collect over time show that when something happens first, then the economy goes up or the economy goes down. So when you look at that item, that can be considered a leading indicator. It's not always a guarantee that it's going to happen that way because there are so many variables involved with the economy. But leading indicators typically do provide some level of a prediction for where the economy is going. You will never really find out until you get there and collect the data and then do the analysis, but a leading indicator can give some predictive analysis for it. All of the market-based economies are looking at three goals. You want to have growth, you want your economy to make more money than it used to, you want to have people employed, so you want to have a low unemployment rate, and you'd like to have price stability. If prices are going up and down all the time, it becomes very difficult for consumers to predict how to spend their money, and they may start to not spend their money, which will not result in growth. If you have stability, people are making money, there are no supply shocks, people have access to the products that they have in demand, it makes it a lot easier. Governments that are stable, politically stable, economically stable, make it easier for businesses to predict what's going on. If everything changes every day, it's hard for you to plan how you're going to spend your money 6 months from now, or a year from now, or 10 years from now. The most successful economies are typically based in countries that have the most political, legal, and economic stability over a longer period of time. If you want to look at measuring the health of the economy for growth, one of the economic indicators that you can look at is gross domestic product. What you would do is, for example, in the United States, you would look at the market value of all the goods and services produced by companies domestically in the United States for a given year. If all of that aggregate production goes up, then you can say that the GDP has gone up and therefore the economy is growing. This is slightly different than gross national product, which includes all of the international work that a country may do. You may have companies based in the United States with subsidiaries elsewhere in foreign business as well. When you add all of that together, it's the gross national product. But the gross domestic product is really what's going on within the borders of a nation. And it's a more accurate indicator of how that particular country is performing. High employment can be looked at by looking at the unemployment rate. If the unemployment rate is low, you can assume that people are employed. The interesting thing about the unemployment rate is that the nation uses the number of people who apply for unemployment benefits to determine whether or not people are employed. This is not always the most accurate way to do it, but it is the more easy way of doing it. The only way you could tell if people were truly employed or unemployed would be to ask everybody, and that's kind of a difficult thing to do. When people lose their jobs, they typically apply to the local state where they live for unemployment benefits. And the states can very quickly put that information together as data to show that if a lot more people are asking for unemployment, then we know that more people are unemployed. However, unemployment doesn't last forever. Typically, it's 13 weeks or 26 weeks, or it may be extended in bad economic times to a year or even 2 years. But eventually, if you no longer get a job and you're no longer eligible for unemployment, then you are unemployed, but you may not count in the statistic that we use. So while the unemployment rate is a useful tool, it is not a perfect reflection of how many people are actually working or not working. On the bright side, we use the same information all the time. So you're comparing this somewhat flawed information, but we're using the same basis of it before. So you still have an apples to apples comparison. If we're comparing unemployment data for unemployment insurance claims today, we did that 20 years ago, we did that 50 years ago. So you can still map how well we're doing based on that information. Price stability is collected by the Consumer Price Index. This is basically a market basket of goods that the government analyzes. They'll look at the cost of a particular set of goods and services over a particular period of time, typically in a quarter or in a year, and then they compare it to previous quarters and previous years, and they calculate the rate of increase as a percentage. That's pretty much where you get your inflation from. So if a loaf of bread cost $3 last year and it costs $4 this year, the consumer price index says that it went up 33%. Conversely, if prices drop, then that would be deflation and that would be caught in the CPI. If you go to Moodle, I did put a CPI calculator so you can pick a year, put in a dollar amount, and then find out how much money was worth on that particular date. So again, GDP, we've already gone over. As I noted, GDP only refers to the goods that are produced within that country. Intermediate goods, not necessarily raw materials, but materials that are used to create a finished product, are not included in the calculation. The reason is if you counted the intermediate goods, say a piece of plywood or some other wood that was used in the creation of a furniture, when you counted the furniture being sold, you would be double counting that. So it would show an erroneous high level of growth. Regarding employment, there are three categories of unemployment: cyclical unemployment, which is when usually we have a recession, so people lose their jobs in a cycle. You have structural unemployment, where it's unable to provide the jobs that everybody needs because there's a mismatch and it's not going to be fixed by economic development. You may have a great need for engineers, and we don't have enough engineers. So then that's something wrong with the structure. It's not just that the engineers lost their jobs because the economy did bad. Then when the economy does better, the engineers get their job back. If you don't have enough engineers, then you're never going to have a good level of high employment because you can't satisfy the demand for those jobs. Frictional unemployment, this is a time period when a worker is searching or transitioning from a job to another. So they're trying to get a job, they may be interviewing, they may be looking for another job. It's basically the time period during which people are looking to get a job but haven't quite found one yet. Price stability, we've already talked about inflation, so that's when prices rise due to some kind of disequilibrium between supply and demand for a period of time. Same with deflation. You should read the articles that I've posted about that as well. Hyperinflation is just really bad inflation. If you have hyperinflation, we're not talking about 5% or 10%. We may be talking about 100% or 1,000% inflation. If you have 5% inflation, that means $1 today, next year would only be worth 95 cents. You'd need $1.05 to be able to buy what $1 used to buy a year ago with 5% inflation. If you have 1,000% inflation, that means you need $10. So you're talking about multiple factors on top of that. And hyperinflation can typically get out of control. And countries that print their own money, thereby increasing the supply of money but decreasing its value, you may need to spend money at an incredibly high rate, and that results in price instability. You can't predict what people are going to be able to purchase because they can't predict how much things are going to cost. When you have growth in the economy, there is typically some inflationary pressure. The Federal Reserve likes to see inflation around 1, 2, or 3%. That's the target, and that's why they're taking the anti-inflation steps today to try to minimize inflation. When inflation drops below a particular level, then they'll start decreasing the interest rates. But until then, they're going to keep the interest rates high or even continue to raise them. The reason why inflation is bad is if you put money in your pocket and you haven't spent it yet, and there's price inflation, the money in your pocket is worth less. That gives you an incentive to buy things immediately. But if you do that, there'll be less of a supply. And when there's less of a supply of something, those prices usually inflate. Again, this slide just talks about the Consumer Price Index, which we've already mentioned. They talk about the market basket. They look at 8 things: food and beverages, housing, apparel, transportation, etc. Housing is not necessarily comparable to things like food and beverage or apparel. Sometimes the housing market can basically just go off and do its own thing. Same with recreation. Generally, you can look at inflation as the entire economy, how much a price is going up in general. But the overall inflation rate could be pegged because, let's say you have runaway housing costs. Everything else pretty much stays the same. If you're trying to buy a house, that's a problem. If you're not, you may not notice it that much. But the overall inflation rate could be considered high because one particular component is much higher than the rest. You can even have deflation in one of these categories, while other categories have inflation. That's a little bit rare, but it does happen. The Consumer Confidence Index is simply a way to measure how much optimism people have. If you ask a consumer, how do you think things are going? Do you have enough money to buy things? They measure that, and then they compare that to previous years as well. That's a good indicator for people in business, because if consumer confidence is low, then you have to anticipate that maybe people aren't going to be buying as much because they're a little bit nervous about whether or not they're going to be able to support themselves. So this slide just explains what gross domestic product is. It also talks about a budget deficit, but we're not really going to talk about that in this chapter. Maybe a little bit later, just so that you know, the federal government operates just like any other company. They have money coming in, revenues, in the form of taxes. They have tax revenue in the Internal Revenue Service. They're the ones who do the taxes. And then the government spends. When the government spends more than they bring in, you have a deficit. When the government brings in more than it spends, you have a surplus. If you have a deficit in one year and you had a deficit the previous year, you add those two deficits together and you get the debt. The United States has not had a surplus since the 1990s. We spend more money than we bring in revenue. How do we do that? We borrow it. We borrow it by issuing bonds, which is essentially a loan. So if we spend more money than we bring in, we are still paying for it, but we're paying for it with borrowed money, which is going to be more expensive when we pay it off. The national debt today is well in excess of $20 trillion, and the interest payments on that are approaching $1 trillion a year. Here's just an overview of what the GDP looks like globally. When I first started teaching this course, China was not even in the top 10. The United States is first as of GDP for 2022, according to the World Bank, with about $25 trillion. So every year we produce about $25 trillion. The population is only 333 million. It's still a large country, but it's not by any stretch the biggest country in the world. That would be China. And very shortly, I believe India may have actually passed China in terms of population. So if you look at per capita, capo is the Latin term for head. If you speak Spanish or Italian or some other languages, it's probably a similar term. Per capita means by head. So if you count the number of people, we got 333 million people, there are 333 million heads. So you divide 333 million into 25 trillion. The average of that per capita for every person in the United States is $76,000. China has the second largest GDP, but you can see because they have 1.4 billion people, their per capita income is only 12,000. Earlier, we talked about manufacturing and why the United States is a service economy. If you're going to manufacture something in the United States and the average per capita is 76,000, you want to go to a country where it's cheaper. So China, the average income is only 12,000. The average income in India is only 2,000. So if you're paying people $2,000 a year to manufacture things, those products are going to be cheaper. The per capita GDP is a good indication as to which countries may be exporting more because they're advantageous in terms of their labor expense. China and the US are basically running away with GDP. Japan, Germany, India, the UK, France, Italy, Canada, a lot of the EU is on this list. It's interesting to note which countries have the biggest GDP and which countries actually have the most personal wealth based on per capita. Ireland, for example, which is not on this list, has a per capita income of over $100,000 a year. I believe Luxembourg, which is a tiny nation state in Europe, it's something like 150,000 a year. So some countries with smaller populations with good economies, they actually have very high per capita, but they're not particularly large in terms of global economy. A business cycle is an aggregation of data over time. Typically, you have growth and contraction cycles. You'll make a lot of money for a little while, then you'll have a recession, you'll contract a little bit. As you can see on this chart, you'll have these cycles that go through expansion and contraction. Typically, the way the United States works is we have these ups and downs, but the main line in the middle is usually trending upwards. So you may have a lot of ups and downs, but overall, our economy has been growing. And over the last 50 years, it's grown considerably. Stages of the economic cycle include expansion. That's when you have high employment, high economic growth, a little bit of inflation because there's pressure on prices due to this expansion causing disequilibrium. The peak is the highest point of the business cycle. That's usually when you either plateau and stay there, or typically you end up dropping after a while. When you drop, that's known as a contraction. So that's a correction because people may have been investing in something too much, and then when they realized how much it was actually worth, the prices start to drop, unemployment increases, deflation may follow, pricing pressures subside. A trough is when the slowing ceases. So the peak is the highest point. The trough, if you think of a trough like, a bathtub, it's a concave shape. So the trough is the bottom. It's essentially the opposite of the peak. It's the lowest point. And usually you would experience some type of growth. When you reach the trough, you'd go up from there. Business cycle fluctuations are measured by GDP. An interesting thing about GDP is real GDP is when you correct things for inflation. When people say that the average American is making $55,000 a year, that's more than they were making in 1973, 50 years ago, which it was probably 10,000. I don't have the data in front of me. So you could think, wow, we're doing really, really well. But money today is worth less than it used to be worth in 1973. So $55,000 today may be worth $8,000 in 1973. So if you were making 10,000 in 73, you were actually making more money. Even though nominally the number is smaller, it had more purchasing power. So the only way that you can really compare different time periods is to adjust it for the inflation that happened over that period of time. If you're making $105,000 this year and you're only making $100,000 last year, that's great. You made 5% more. But if inflation was 8%, your purchasing power is 3% less. So in order to understand how much money is actually worth or how much purchasing power you actually have, you need to correct your income or GDP or whatever measure that you're using against inflation, because it's the only way that you can properly understand how well you're performing. As noted previously, a recession is 2 quarters of economic contraction. A quarter of a year is 3 months. So if you have 6 months during which the GDP has contracted, we are considered to be in a recession. If it just stays down or if it continues to drop for a longer period of time, you could be considered to be in a depression. We really haven't called any of our economic cycles a depression since the 1930s. This next chart actually shows why the 1930s were so bad. If you look between 1930 and 1933, late 30s, it was contracting by 5, 10, even almost 15% per year. In the early 1940s, World War II started, and the government started spending a lot of money to be able to pay for the military action. They borrowed a lot of money too, but that money was used to put into the economy for manufacturing and to employ people for the war effort. And the economy exploded. It went up by almost 20% a year. When the war stopped in 1945, we had a recession. Almost as bad a drop in the short term as it was during the Great Depression. But then, you can see the business cycles, the ups and downs overall. We had a big contraction in the early 1980s, relatively big, not as big as post-war or depression. We had another big contraction around 2008 when the housing market collapsed. And you can see at the very end of this chart, there's a contraction because of the pandemic in 2020, which we have rebounded from pretty aggressively. If you look at the most recent ones between 21, 22, 23, it's probably going to level off at between 1 and 2% growth. That's going to be it for chapter 2.